Okay, so we are up and running. So tonight's topic for our Pathway to Judaism course is anti-Semitism. I don't put this topic first because it's a little discouraging, but I also don't want to leave it all the way till the end this year because I think it's important for people that are embracing Judaism as a choice for their life, as opposed to those who were born Jewish and choose to continue to live, to understand what you face. Being Jewish is not without risk. Being Jewish does come with a great deal of hatred and animosity from a number of other people. It's not the majority of the world, thank God, but there are plenty. And as I'm sure you are aware from earlier late last year, the shooting in Pittsburgh at the synagogue will remind you that there are some people who take their hatred of Jews very, very seriously, up to and including lethal attacks. Oftentimes it's more just violence, and sometimes it is just vandalism, and other times it is simply rude words or discrimination. But the hatred of Jewish people is alive and well. In fact, it is the largest category of people who are targeted by hate crimes for religious reasons are still Jews in this country. We are still the victim of more hate crimes than any other religious group put together. So even though we are a very, very small population, we get a lot of attention. Some of it good, some of it bad. So we're going to talk tonight about the types of anti-Semitism that are out there, because there is a smorgasbord, a selection of different ways that people are anti-Semitic. I should point out that for some people, the choice of explanation why they are anti-Semitic comes after they've already decided they don't like us. That is to say, they've already decided they don't like Jews, and then they will create an explanation for why they don't like Jews, and they'll choose some of the different topics from this list of why they don't like us. But for some people, they are led to their anti-Semitism because of their beliefs in some of the different realms of human activity. And that's what we're going to get to. And then we'll also talk about whether anti-Israelism is also anti-Semitism, which is to say the people who are uniquely agitated, angry, upset about Israel, whether that is a form of anti-Semitism or whether it is something separate. And we'll talk about how to tell the difference. Okay. Cultural anti-Semitism. So cultural anti-Semitism are people who have no gripe with Judaism as a religion, but they are upset with Judaism or Jews as a nation, as a people. This is separate from racial anti-Semitism, which we'll get to at the near the end. This is more just they don't like our culture, they don't like our values, they don't like how we as a group live. They don't care what we say about God, they don't care about our rituals or our religion. They just don't like how we live. And this is probably the earliest form of anti-Semitism, at least that we have records of. They will often claim that not only is Judaism a way of life that is inferior, but it is actually corrosive, that it harms the humans who practice it. Some of the attacks talk about laziness. After all, we give up 1/7 of our life for non-productive work. Right. So on Shabbat, we don't go and work in the fields. On Shabbat, we don't work in factories. On Shabbat, we're not painting, masterpieces. And there are some cultures who think that that is offensive, that how dare we rest, right? How dare we not use every moment that God gave us to show our mastery over the world. There are other people who argue that we are legalistic or that we are argumentative. That is to say that they don't like the way that Jews debate, that Jews will engage in discussion. For some cultures, that is a negative thing. Obviously, in Judaism, we think it's positive, but not every culture agrees. They will often be very upset just because we're different, just because we don't fit in. If you live in a society where everyone is clean-shaven and the Jewish men have beards, you're setting yourself apart. If you live in a society where everyone eats sea urchins and you don't, you're setting yourself apart. And for some cultures, that's fine. I like to believe that at least the ideals of the United States, says that having different types of people is a good thing, even if in practice some people don't agree with that. But there are some cultures that value everyone being the same. And for Jews not to fit in, that makes them upset. And these have been going around for at least 2,000 years. Is someone telling me there's a problem? No, good. So we go all the way back to Egypt in the 3rd century BCE. So 2,300 years ago, we have a writer known as Manetho, depending upon how you want to pronounce his name. He was an Egyptian priest, and he wrote histories. And in his history of that area, he talked about us. And in his version, he said the Hebrews were not, they weren't liberated by Moses, that Egypt kicked us out, right? It wasn't that we left against their wishes. Egypt wanted us to go, he says, because we were lepers. We all had leprosy. And that meant, they wanted to get rid of these disgusting people. And that we were taught, in his mind, shamefully, by Moses not to adore the gods, right? We turned our back on Isis, and we turned our back on Set and all of the Osiris and all the Egyptian gods. And in his mind, that's terrible. How dare you reject the Egyptian gods? You're just a bunch of lepers. We got rid of you. Good riddance. Now, obviously, we don't agree with his version of history, but you can see that he was already agitated by our rejection of his culture and by our version of the story, which said that we had left in strength rather than left by being expelled. Roman writers who would occupy and take over the land of Israel a little while later, they also generally speak unfavorably of the Jews. This was partly because we rejected the Hellenistic culture, which heavily influenced Rome as well, originated in Greece, but it also influenced Rome. And we didn't really fit in with that. That's the whole story of Hanukkah and the fight of the Maccabees. But also because we really were a pain in the neck for Rome. There were multiple Jewish revolts against Roman control. And if you are the empire and one group keeps fighting, you kind of get annoyed with that group. And so many of the Roman writers wrote against Jews because we were a thorn. You can imagine that, or rather not imagine, but you can see a parallel in the writing of many people in the 17 and 1800s in the United States who wrote very negatively about the Native Americans. Because the Native Americans kept trying to fight back as America took more and more of their land. And the writers would then write, oh, those terrible Native Americans, they eat children and blah, blah, blah. They would invent all sorts of stories because they wanted to feel good about what they were doing to the victims of American attacks. So Rome was much the same way. And we know that they really didn't like us because when they conquered and finally subdued us a few times, they would mint coins and they would make giant monuments to celebrate defeating us. Now, remember, we're a tiny little country compared to the Roman Empire. But boy, were they really proud when they finally conquered us, and did it multiple times. If you fast forward, you might imagine that in the 16, 17, and 1800s, as the Enlightenment comes into Europe, that this type of cultural anti-Semitism would go away. The Enlightenment teaches that all humans are created equal. It's the foundation of the American Declaration of Independence, for example. And we would hope that this would bring new life. And indeed, it did for many people. But even in that age, there were still anti-Semites that were against us culturally. Johann Davis in 1782 wrote, does the law of Moses make citizenship and the full integration of the Jew into other peoples difficult or impossible? I think it does. Right? He's saying, if you're Jewish, there's no way for you to be Dutch. If you're Jewish, there's no way for you to be French. If you're Jewish, there's no way for you to be what would later be called Italian. Right? He is saying that Judaism prevents you from fitting into the host culture because it's just not right. Right? The purpose of the law is to maintain the Jew as a people almost completely separate from other peoples. And this purpose is an integral part of all the laws, down to those concerning kosher and non-kosher food, with the result that the Jews have lived as a separate group during 1700 years of dispersion. he's kind of right, right? The laws that we keep do make divisions between us and other people, right? I can't go eat at McDonald's. And that means that I don't get to hang out at McDonald's with other people. And what we eat and don't eat and how we celebrate or don't celebrate our holidays, that does create sometimes a bit of a gap in the way we live our life compared to the person next door to us. For him, that meant absolutely we could never be part of Dutch culture or British culture or French culture. Obviously, we as Jews say, does it really matter if I worship on Saturday rather than Sunday? Does that mean I can't enjoy the freedoms and the rights and responsibilities of being a citizen of a country? And we've obviously come to the answer that yes, we can absolutely work with a country, even though we do some things different, because we are able to share our humanity, even if we express our worship in different ways. Did you have a question? It looked like you were just about.
No, I'm just excited.
Okay, so onward. Christian Wilhelm von Dohm, who was actually a supporter of Jewish people and wanted to help us, he wrote the following in 1781. But impartiality would demand that if a Jew and a Christian applicant show equal capability, right, two people show up for the job interview, the latter, the Christian, deserves preference. So if I've got an equally skilled Jew and an equally skilled Christian, and they both come to my company and they want a job,
And you want to be impartial.
and I want to be impartial,
Mhm.
I would naturally pick the Christian. Right? That was his position, right? This seems obvious, to be an obvious right of the majority in the nation, right? If you are the majority, you deserve perks. Right? That was his thinking. You're the native and they're the foreigner. And therefore, the native should always get to be first in line if everything else is being equal. At least, and this is where he makes his offer, at least until the Jews, by wiser treatment, meaning until we figure out what's smart for us, are changed into entirely equal citizens and all differences polished off. Right? So as soon as we remove everything that makes us Jewish, that makes us different, then yes, that would be fine. But in the meantime, as long as we're different, we should expect to be second class. And that's just natural in his mind. And that was natural in the 1780s for many, many people. And this was the enlightened view. And he went on to say, for all these reasons, and trusting that human nature is the same in all people, again, very high enlightenment value, I am convinced that in a few generations, the Jews will be just like all of the citizens in those states, which will give them equal rights. So his ideal was, give the Jews equal rights, and eventually they'll stop being different. And when they stop being different, then everything will be fine, right? That was his solution to the Jewish question in Europe. It's what's known as assimilation. That this was a new enticement that Jews had to face, and one that when we talk about Jewish history in the later episodes, we'll cover. But we were no longer being told to give up what we were doing because we were wrong. We were being told, give up what you're doing and we'll like you more. The idea of the more you copy me, the more I'll accept you. And that means all you have to do is basically give up anything that makes you different. And that's not really the right price to make someone pay to be a citizen of a country. Okay, but let's talk about a different type of anti-Semitism, one that is still around, called theological anti-Semitism. Theological means that there are some groups that hate Judaism and Jews because of our beliefs, because of our faith. It doesn't matter what culture we are. It doesn't matter, whether you speak the same language as me or whether you wear the same clothes as me. What matters in with Rome, yes, Judaism's monotheism was right up against all of the pagan pantheons. So when we looked at Egypt and we saw them worshiping Osiris and worshiping Set and all of that, we went, that's not right. And they were offended by that, as you can imagine. And that type of religious debate, I think, is perfectly legitimate. And I understand why they didn't like being told that worshiping idols was not good. So that is somewhat fair, although to hate an entire group of people because of that religious discussion, that's not quite right. However, under Christianity, both Catholicism and Protestantism, there was anger at the Jews for our refusal to accept Jesus. And it was also necessary to justify the new faith, meaning Christianity, which came out of Judaism, as being a replacement for the old, the so-called supersessionist theology, that they had superseded us. Jews became the focus of blame as well for the crucifixion when missionaries were seeking favor with the Roman Empire, right? If you go to Rome and you say, you should become Christian, and they say, well, who founded your faith? And they say, well, this guy Jesus. And they say, well, where is he? And they say, well, actually, he's dead. He was crucified. The Romans say, well, wait, who crucified him? If you say, well, you did, it's not a great sales tactic. But if you say, well, the Jewish people did, and you know how much trouble the Jews are, then it makes life a lot easier to try and spread your faith. And so early Christians were very eager to shift the blame for the crucifixion from the Romans, who did the actual killing, to the Jews, who were blamed for not preventing the actual killing, which if you were a police officer, you'd usually be more worried about the person who pulled the trigger than the person who didn't stop the person from pulling the trigger. And a similar response was also seen in the Quran when Jews refused to accept Muhammad as a prophet. When Muhammad first came, he expected the Jews to flock to his new faith. And we said, look, monotheism, we're good, right? Islam is a huge step above all of the pagan stuff that was going on in Saudi Arabia before Muhammad came around. But we're good. We've got ours. And you go with this, and that's fine. And Muhammad and then later Muslims were not 100% happy with that response. They wanted us to give up our Judaism and join them. And when we didn't, that created a lot of anger. So I just want to point out one of the things here that gets often lost in modern discussions because it gets downplayed, but it's still a core anxiety for many Christians, which is, if you don't say Judaism is wrong, and thus you don't say Jews are stubborn and stupid for being Jewish, then you also are saying you don't have to be Christian. Remember, Christianity came out of the idea that there was no way to be saved from hell except by accepting Jesus, right? That is like Christianity basic idea. If you don't accept Jesus, you go to hell. And if you say that Jews don't accept Jesus, we need to be going to hell, right? That has to be their response. And if you try to say, well, no, actually Judaism, that's okay, then why can't I be Jewish instead of Christian, right? It doesn't fit the logic of their faith. So that's why they had to sort of replace us and say, yeah, in the old days, in that Torah book, that was okay for them. But now there's a new book called the Christian Bible, and that erases all the old stuff. And now this is the new way. And people who don't get with the new way, they're all in trouble now. And so that became an important cornerstone. In fact, it was so important that St. Augustine, I would not exactly have put up as being a saint, but the Catholic Church did, so I'll use his official title. He wrote that anti-Semitism was required, that it was not an option, that you needed to be anti the Jew. As he put it, the church admits and avows, right? It swears the Jewish people to be cursed because after killing Christ, his word, they continue to till the ground of an earthly circumcision, an earthly Sabbath, an earthly Passover, while the hidden strength or virtue of making known Christ. So what he's basically saying is, look, the Jewish people, they're still doing stuff. They're still observing Shabbat physically. They're still observing circumcision physically. They're still observing Passover physically. And as far as he's concerned, Jesus came to get rid of all that stuff, right? It's all supposed to be spiritual now. So we're still caught up in the physical, and he thinks we should all be only doing the spiritual stuff with Jesus. And therefore we are cursed because we're banging our head against the wall. The Jewish people, like Cain, continue tilling the ground in the carnal observance of the law, which does not yield to them its strength because they do not perceive in it the grace of Christ, right? If we don't have Jesus's blessing, it doesn't matter how much good we do. It doesn't matter how much ground we till, right? If we do all sorts of good commandments, we help the poor, we help the needy, we heal this. That doesn't matter if we don't also have Jesus, which is a basic Christian position. And therefore we're cursed, right? We are damned forever. Judaism, since Christ, is a corruption. Indeed, Judas, the guy who betrayed Jesus, is the image of the Jewish people. Their understanding of Scripture is carnal, right? It's all about the body. They bear the guilt for the death of the Savior, for through their fathers they have killed Christ. So, in addition to saying that the Jews in the Roman time killed Jesus, Augustine is also saying every Jew who has lived since carries that guilt. So if you meet a Jew today, walking down the streets 2018, or 2019, sorry, that person killed Jesus. Right? They are guilty of that crime. And for almost 2,000 years, this was Catholic belief. Eventually, the Catholic Church would say, we're not going to hold Jews alive today responsible for what happened. But that didn't happen until the 20th century. And even still, there are many, many places where, although the Catholic Church formally made that statement, for which I'm very grateful, many, many people didn't get the memo. And they still call Jews, Christ killers and other such flattering terms. So that has not gone away completely. In fact, there is a statement just in 2010 by the Special Synod of the Bishops for the Middle East. We Christians cannot speak of the Promised Land as an exclusive right for a privileged Jewish people, meaning the Jewish people and Israel, there's no special connection. This promise was nullified by Christ. When Jesus came, the Jewish connection to Israel was canceled. In the kingdom of God, there is no longer a chosen people. Right? It's been erased. Well, they have to believe that, right? If they don't believe that, then why be Christian?
It's like reassuring.
It's actually worse than that.
Oh my
gosh.
Of course. I mean, it has replaced. So that idea is, yeah, it's a fairly necessary belief for people in this particular mindset. Because again, if we're still have a special relationship with God in our own path, and we have a special relationship with the land of Israel, then why did all the other stuff come along, right? Why Jesus? Why the Christian Bible? Why their belief? Just be Jewish and carry on. So they have to take away anything from Judaism in order to open up the world for themselves, which is why when they say there's no longer a chosen people, it's not exactly true, because most Christians will tell you that they are the new chosen people because they follow Jesus, and so they get to escape hell, and the rest of us don't, which if that doesn't count as being chosen, I'm not sure what counts.
I thought that after the Holocaust, they had seen where the teachings had led to and had stopped talking like that, especially when they said, don't blame the Jews of today, what the Jews did. I am shocked that this is 2010. But that would not, in their mind, if you ask them, is that anti-Semitism? They would say no. That's just Christian belief.
You know my boy, right? My oldest boy. He at school was asked last week, what is your faith? He says Judaism, right? Yeah. And the boy told him, this is a Christian country. Right. Go back to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know? This was last week.
Right.
And then I went to church with that one guy that I invited here, and they were teaching about the Romans, right? Like I figured out that Barnabas was a Roman spy and corrupted that guy Paul, and because the Romans saved him at one point that he was going to get stuff. Anyways, but I figured out that they hate us. They go to church on Sundays, and then they teach to hate Jews because they stone Paul.
So it's not a question of always hate. It's a question of just what is necessary for their belief structure. And one of the things that's necessary for their belief structure is that Judaism can't be valid, right? We can't be right, because if we're right, they're wrong, and that upsets them. So for some of them, it's just a debate point. For others, it becomes violent, and that's what they're still wrestling with. One of the ways that theology has promoted violence is what we call the blood libel. This is a charge that Jewish people, remember, not true, but this is what they claim, that Jewish people take the blood of non-Jews and we use it for some of our rituals and our rites. In particular, they claim we use it, they will often claim we use it for our matzah for Passover, because they claim that we are trying to mimic their, I just lost the word, Christian word, communion, right? the way the communion works, the wafer becomes the body of Jesus. Well, since we can't have communion, we have to duplicate it, they claim, by using the blood of a Christian to make our own special communion blood. And obviously this is wrong, right? Because as we've already talked about with regards to keeping kosher, we don't eat blood. Blood is like one of the most we don't do. But this has been going along. Well, even
I never heard that
hold on.
before, but it's funny.
Yeah.
'Cause
Yeah.
my background is.
Well, hold on. Let me explain first, right? So even as far back as 460 to 370 BCE, Democritus wrote, every 7 years, the Jews capture a stranger, brought him to the temple in Jerusalem, and sacrificed him, cutting his flesh into bits. Now, obviously not true, right? But this was already a belief that far back. However, and Appian, who was one of the main anti-Semites against us during the time of the Romans, he also wrote that we would sacrifice captives during the Maccabee Wars. Again, no evidence, no proof, and nothing that Jews would ever do. Where this became especially bad was 1144 in the community of Norwich in England. The community was accused of ritually murdering a boy called William of Norwich. And Thomas Monmouth claimed that an international group of Jews had to kill a child in order to return us to Israel. And hundreds of other false claims have cost thousands of Jews their lives. So this, you can see, is beginning to introduce the idea that A, we're killing kids for our purposes, and B, this notion of being an international group, that there is a secret network of Jews that are trying to do stuff around the world. This becomes a very, very common belief. Now, it was based around the fact that everywhere you went in Europe, you would find Jewish communities because we had been scattered. And if you went to North Africa or the Middle East, you'd also find Jewish communities. And those Jewish communities were often very helpful to each other for creating trade links.
And we could talk to each other. We had this language.
We had a shared language, and we had a shared faith system that allowed us to trust one another when others wouldn't trust us. And that was useful for us because it allowed us to engage in business and trade. But that was also used against us as though somehow we were sneaky just because we connected to people around the world. And so this idea of the international Jewish conspiracy becomes a very, very common, and to this very day, is still used by many, many people, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly. You'll hear people use terms like globalists or Jewish global agenda and other types of phrases. You'll often find when people talk about powers that are trying to control a country, they'll give a list of international leaders, and that list will often be 95% or more Jewish. Now, are they doing it on purpose, or are they just passing on the belief of other people without realizing that what they're saying is anti-Semitic? Each individual person, it has to be judged separately. But definitely there are many people who believe that there is this secret network of Jewish powerful people, the Rothschilds and George Soros and all of that are always working to try and control other countries. Simply not true. If it were, we'd be a lot better off. I always say that if there is a Jewish conspiracy, I'm not getting my share. No one sends me a check that says, your portion of the Jewish conspiracy money. We never get any of it. So it is a shame. All right, now let's turn to the newest form of anti-Semitism, but the one that most people are either familiar with or have forgotten about, which is racial anti-Semitism. So with the rise of modern biology, and in particular with the idea of Darwinism, of the idea of species and survival of the fittest, many modern thinkers, beginning in the 1800s and to this day, used race as an excuse to despise Jews. Unlike the earlier forms, the cultural or theological forms of anti-Semitism, we've got no hope of escaping these charges, right? No conversion, no renunciation of people can change your racial type. And indeed, during World War II, the Nazis, who are the most famous users of the racial types of anti-Semitism, if somebody had converted to Christianity and they knew that they were Jewish, they went to the camps too. Right? It didn't matter that they were no longer practicing Judaism. They put anybody who had Jewish ancestry into the camps. That was their mission and their goal, because they believed in this race. And To understand why, we will turn to Adolf himself, because he explains it very clearly. And it's often surprising how little people listened to him before he took power, but he said what he wanted to do and why he wanted to do it, and then he did it. So we take these statements very seriously to this day. So Gobineau and Chamberlain were inspired by our concept of a new order. I tell you, or if you prefer, an ideological glimpse into history in accordance with the basic principle of the blood. Right now, the blood is often a almost spiritual usage of what we would call DNA, of genes, of race. We do not judge by merely artistic or military standards, or even by purely scientific one. And this is where he is moving from just being a scientist idea. We judge by the spiritual energy which a people is capable of putting forth, which will enable it in 10 years to recapture what it had lost in 1,000 years of warfare. So his idea was that inside the blood of different races, there was this like magic power for some that would always lead them to the top, and there was evil in others that would always lead them to the bottom. And even if something was messed up in the meantime, the blood would eventually win, right? That's why he says this like spiritual type of energy. I intend to set up a 1,000-year Reich, and anyone who supports me in battle is a fellow fighter for a unique spiritual, I would almost say divine creation, right? He views himself as doing holy work to allow the true good blood of the world to rise to the top. At the decisive moment, the decisive factor is not the ratio of strength, but the spiritual force employed. It doesn't matter how big your army is, it matters how good your race is. Now, so what's his problem with us? Well, the Jews have always been a people with definite racial characteristics and never a religion. Right? He did not believe we were religion. He believed we were a race and only a race. Only in order to get ahead, he, meaning the Jewish people, early sought for a means which he could distract unpleasant attention from his person. So basically, we have faked being religious when in fact we are just a race. And what would have been more expedient and at the same time more innocent than the embezzled concept of a religious community? For hereto everything is borrowed, or rather stolen. Due to his own original special nature, the Jew cannot possess a religious institution, if for no other reason because he lacks idealism in any form, and hence belief in a hereafter is absolutely foreign to him, right? So what he's trying to say is, Jews, by our race, by our blood, in his opinion, we can't have an idealism. We can't imagine the world being better, and we can't imagine there being a life after death, right? That we're like an animal, that we never think about anything in the grand scheme. We never think about heaven or anything afterwards. And if you don't, then you are obviously going to be horrid. And if you don't, for him, you can't be religious. And therefore, even if we may act like we have a religion, in his opinion, it's just performance, because our blood prevents us from having that. And a religion in the Aryan sense cannot be imagined, which lacks the conviction of survival after death in some form. Now, I disagree with him on this everything here, but I should also point out that Judaism does believe in life after death, right? Judaism does teach that, and we'll cover that in a later lesson in more detail. So he is wrong in his analysis of what Jews believe, and of course he is fundamentally wrong in what it is to be a Jew. Carrying on from him, it is true, we Germans are barbarians. That is an honored title to us. I free humanity from the shackles of the soul, from the degrading suffering caused by the false vision called conscience and ethics. Right? So if you're not that familiar with what Hitler was trying to achieve and why, Hitler believed in what was known as the Übermensch ideal, the Superman ideal. And I don't mean Superman, you know, Batman, Superman. What he believed was that there were certain people who were naturally designed, right? Their DNA, their race, to be like gods, right? To be incredible and amazing people. But he argued there was a problem. The problem was all the people that were supposed to be rising to their greatness had been chained by ethics and conscience. That for some reason, people believe that the powerful shouldn't use their power, that the powerful should say, you know what, if this person is weak, I'll take care of him, rather than if this person is weak, I'll use him, right? Because that's what the powerful should do in his mind, right? The weak should be on top, standing on the strong should be on top, standing on the bodies of the weak, because how else are the strong meant to rise up? And if you tell the strong, oh, no, 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 don't do that, then you are keeping the strong man from rising to his heights. And in his mind, that was the sin, right? The sin was that there was this thing called ethics. And who does he blame for ethics? The Jews have inflicted two wounds on mankind: circumcision on its body and conscience on its soul. Right? He is giving us credit, blame, for introducing the idea of having a conscience, for giving us the idea of ethics. He is saying that is a poison that we have put into the world because it has made strong people act like they're weak, which we consider a good thing. And so for that, he's actually right. I mean, not that we're the only people who have a conscience or who brought the idea, but we do believe that having a conscience, that having ethics, that having limits on the powerful, that is what God wants in the world. And the powerful should not just do whatever they feel like. However, he says they were Jewish inventions. The war for the domination of the world is waged only between these two camps alone, the Germans and the Jews. Everything else is but deception, right? In his mind, there were two groups. There were the Germans, who were supposed to be the masters of the world because they were the best, right? That's his belief. And then there were the Jews, and we were trying to stop them. And if you try to stop, I mean, imagine if you have somebody at the Olympics, Usain Bolt. And imagine if someone said, oh, well, Usain Bolt, he makes all the other runners feel bad. So we're going to make him carry 50 pounds of bricks on his back when he runs. Right? You would all say, well, that's not fair. Right? That's not fair. I mean, whoever is the fastest should get the gold medal. Well, Hitler and many others who were with him, they took that idea much further and said, not only should you get the gold medal if you're the fastest, you should also be able to tell everyone else what to do if you are the best. You should also be able to use the wealth of other nations if you are the best. And anyone who tells you you shouldn't, they're just trying to chain you up. They're trying to put bricks on your back and keep you from running fast. By the way, can you see why this is so attractive to so many people still to this day? Because a lot of people to this day, white supremacists and neo-Nazis, they believe that they should be at the top of the world. And when they look around and they say, I'm not, right? Because maybe I'm poorer than I should be. Maybe I'm not as happy as I should be. Maybe I'm not as high in my job as I should be. Then they have to say someone else has been rigging the system. Someone else has been chaining me down. And who do they pick? Us. As if we few million could have controlled the entire world. But that is their racial belief, which is what is so stupid about this, because there is no Jewish race, right? The genetic idea of race is very difficult by itself because there are multiple genes responsible for a spectrum of features, right? If you take a DNA test and then you separate out the DNA, which exact DNA are you looking for to find someone who is Black or to find someone who is Hispanic? You can't. You can find groups of genes that say, oh, this person's ancestors probably came from this part of Africa or this part of Latin America or this part of Europe or this part of China. But is there a particular measurement to the eyes, a particular measurement to the lips, a particular color of the skin? Because you can find people who are pale-skinned that live in India that are as white as people who live in Germany. And you can find people who are dark in Europe who are as dark as people who live in other parts of the world. It's not like skin color is like one dimension, right? It's multiple things come together to create a particular ancestry for a person. But you can't make neat little boxes and call it race. And even if you could, we wouldn't fit in a box that goes off DNA, right? Because when it comes to your genes, Judaism doesn't care, right? You can have any set of genes you want and still become Jewish if you weren't already born Jewish. And if you were born Jewish, you could still be born with any set of genes. It's simply we don't attach our faith to our blood. We've never had that idea, and it is sad that the people who hate us decided that they were going to use that idea against us. Make sense? Okay. Anti-Semitism is also extremely creative and flexible. As I mentioned at the very beginning, a lot of people choose to hate the Jews and then choose why they hate the Jews after the war. They've come up with an explanation later. So, for example, in the 1890s to 1990, right, for like the last 100 years, capitalism was fighting communism, right, until the collapse of the Soviet Union. So therefore, Jews must be communists. And you would find many people who would claim Jews are communists. From 1800 to the modern day, communist theories are fighting against capitalists, right? And therefore, the communists said the Jews are capitalists. Now, again, they can't both be right, right? One side or the other has to be getting this right, and that doesn't work. 1960 to the modern day, fighting against civil rights abuses, right? When people are fighting against the people who are trying to keep them down, you have all the civil rights marches. You have a lot of people on the left of the American political spectrum who say Jews are racists. Jews died in the civil rights era, fighting to give rights to more people. 2007 to the modern day, right? Now that we're in economic depression again, the Jews want to impoverish and control the world. So basically, pick whatever your current problem is, and an anti-Semite will blame it on the Jews, right? And again, the hatred comes first, the explanation comes second. And as I said, there's been a more than 100% rise in anti-Semitism since 2015. It is very much and very alarming. Okay, well, let's get to the anti-Israel question, because this is the newest version of anti-Semitism, or at least potentially anti-Semitism. So very important to understand the opening idea here. It is absolutely, perfectly fine and possible to love Israel, meaning the land and her citizens and the people who live there, and to still criticize the government and the specific policies. In fact, it is pretty much the pastime of Israel to do that, right? The vast majority of Israelis criticize their government every single day. Just read Jewish newspapers from Israel, and there is lots and lots of criticism, especially right now with an election coming up in April. In fact, only 30% of the Israelis voted for Netanyahu, the current leader of the Israeli government. So that means 70% wanted someone else to have the job. That is a pretty high percentage of people who are not necessarily unhappy, because, you know, approval goes up and down, but definitely would prefer someone else to have been prime minister. But that does not make them anti-Semitic, right? And that doesn't make them traitors, because just like in our country, you could vote for someone different than whoever our current representative is, senator is, or president is. And that doesn't make you anti-American. It doesn't make you a traitor, even if you say, I don't like what they're doing. That's normal. That's called politics. It's called having an interest in the way a government works. So what does become problematic? Well, all you have to do is do a quick check to figure out whether what someone is saying, or what you might be thinking, is anti-Semitic. Is the criticism only aimed at Israel, or is it aimed at all countries that do likewise? Right? This is the Israel exceptionalism issue. There are some people who will spend their entire life only criticizing Israel, even though other countries do whatever it is they think Israel is doing, or do even worse than what they think Israel is doing. If you only have eyes for Israel, you might be an anti-Semite. If you are saying all the countries that do the things that you don't like are bad, then that's not anti-Semitic. Right? If you are generally in favor of, issue A, and you think Israel is doing bad, and you think Algeria is doing bad, and you think Italy is doing bad, and you say that, that's not anti-Semitic. That's just being interested in a particular issue. Point 2, is the critic able to acknowledge policies where Israel deserves praise? Right? So if you say, I don't like the way Israel handles the Palestinians, but you say, I do like the way that they do something else. For example, one thing that often comes up, the way Israel gives more rights to homosexual communities in Israel. If you can say, I like this, but I don't like that, then your criticism is probably just a criticism and not anti-Semitism. If, on the other hand, you say, that's pinkwashing, which is a real term, right? Used as a version of whitewashing, right? That basically what it's saying is, if you bring up anything good Israel has ever done, I don't want to hear about it because Israel is all bad. If that's your attitude, you're probably anti-Semitic, not just anti-Israel. 3, is there an alternative policy suggested? So if someone says, I don't like the way Israel treats the Palestinians, okay, good. What would you like Israel to do? I don't like the way Israel treats the Palestinians. No, give me an alternative. Well, Israel should no longer be there. You mean all the Jews should leave the country? I mean, is there any other country in the world that you disagree with their policies and you think the people that you don't like in that country should all leave? Is that ever a solution anywhere else in the world? Or is this not really a solution, but just another way of saying, I hate them? And if you can't come up with a legitimate policy alternative, then you might be anti-Semitic. And are all attacks against Israel justified, no matter how indiscriminate? If someone blows up a school, do you say Israel deserves it? If someone blows up a hospital, do you say Israel deserved it? If someone murders a baby, do you say Israel deserved it? Or do you say, you know, I don't like what Israel did, and I think that maybe an army level of violence is justifiable? Not that I think so, but if someone did say that, but I would never accept killing them, then you at least have a chance of not being anti-Semitic. But if you think anybody who is Jewish is fair game because you don't like Israel, then you've gone past the edge of what is reasonable criticism of a government or nation. You have moved into anti-Semitism. 2019 Eurovision, which is happening right now, happening this year in May, I think is when it comes up, is a classic case. Every year, if you're not familiar with the Eurovision, right, the Eurovision has like a big song contest every year, and countries from all over Europe or others that have been invited, including Israel, compete to get the top song for the year. And last year, Israel won. Well, if you win, you get to host for the next year. And many of the people in Europe and other parts of the world have said, well, if Israel's hosting, we shouldn't go. Right? We should boycott this, or we shouldn't broadcast it on our TVs and all of that. And yet, in 2011, when Azerbaijan had won the Eurovision and they were hosting, in that same year, the European Commission concluded that they had absolutely horrible human rights violations. But no one complained. No one said, let's cancel Eurovision. No one said, let's not show Eurovision. Having that on the stage in Azerbaijan, where people, who were criticizing the government were routinely murdered, that was okay. But Israel, that's not okay. That level of double standard, that's a problem. Okay, so lots of things. I'm going to have to try and cut through these really quick, but there are many ways to answer the questions that people bring up about Israel. Right? So people will say, if you lived under occupation, you'd act like a terrorist too. And I'm sorry, but that's simply not true. Because if what you're saying is that people who often feel angry because of their economic or political situation will always use violence, that is not what history shows us. And in fact, the most successful liberation and rights movements throughout the 20th century have been based on nonviolence, whether it be Gandhi in India or Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States and other places around the world. They don't act like terrorists. They choose a nonviolent path in order to bring about change. So just because your life is hard doesn't mean that the terrorism is justified. Others will say, if Israel ended the occupation, the Palestinians or Iran or Al-Qaeda or ISIS or whatever group would no longer attack Israel or the US or others. Right? This is the idea that if Israel just gave the Palestinians what they wanted, then all the violence would stop. But it's, again, not true, because Jews were attacked as soon as they began working their own farms in the 1880s, right? Long before 1948, when Israel became a state. So even before Jews had power, they were already being attacked, right? The PLO was founded, that's the Palestinian Liberation Organization, one of the earliest organized terrorist groups. It was founded before Israel was in control of the West Bank and Gaza. They weren't interested in having the West Bank or Gaza. They wanted everything and all the Jews gone, one way or another. So giving them the West Bank and Gaza is not going to make that wish go away. And radical Islam, of course, is a historical movement with seeds much deeper than just the 20th century. Israel is a focal point, yes, but only because of its historical value, because of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and because of its proximity, because it's close to the Muslim world. And of course, because the Muslims still remember those little things called the Crusades. which made a big difference in how they viewed the outside world, because we did, that is to say, Europe did sort of roll up and try to take that away from them. And radical Islam has ambitions on other Muslim countries and on the rest of the world as well. So even if Israel were to somehow disappear overnight, the violence would continue. And we've seen that more and more in the most recent years with ISIS and Al-Qaeda and others engaged in civil war in many of the other Arab and Muslim nations. It's clear that that's not about Israel. That's just about their agenda. Others will say settlement activity prevents peace negotiations. Settlement meaning in the West Bank, because Gaza is now completely owned by the Palestinians, but in the West Bank, sometimes Israel will allow new apartments and buildings to be made in area that is part of what is called the West Bank, the area that was captured from Jordan in 1967. Well, first of all, talks between parties that recognize the legitimate existence of each other do not need preconditions. You don't tell your spouse, I'll only go to marriage counselor if you make dinner every night from now on. Right? That's not how you start trying to work on a relationship. Right? If you believe that the other one is part of your relationship and they're going to be there and you're stuck with them, then you don't start with preconditions. You just begin talking. Both sides have to be willing to talk, even if they dislike the current policies of the other. And that is a two-way street. Israel has to be willing to talk to the Palestinians without preconditions, and the Palestinians have to be willing to talk to Israel without preconditions. That's what negotiations are. And besides, the vast majority of the so-called settlement activity is expanding a few geographically linked suburbs of Jerusalem and not isolated mountaintop outposts. The 1967 borders were the 1948 ceasefire lines and have no intrinsic value to either side, and therefore that border is open to negotiation. So imagining that somehow Israel has done something wrong is stretching things a little bit. We're just going to skip these because we're running out of time. Okay, so there is also a level of latent anti-Semitism, right? So far, what we've been mainly talking about are people that are, frothing at the mouth, waving swastikas, and very, very heavy anti-Semitism. But there's also anti-Semitism light, the sort of leftover cultural anti-Semitism that people have just believed but never really thought about, but they still act on it. So many commentators, preachers, politicians, and regular people continue to hold stereotypes about Jews that are caused by these negative ideas. So when Jews are thought to be cunning business people or lawyers, that's anti-Semitism, even if it's meant as a compliment. So if someone says, oh, I need to get a Jewish lawyer because of my case, that is a form of anti-Semitism, right? Because trust me, not every Jewish lawyer is great. Right? The ones who belong to this synagogue are, yes. But not every Jewish lawyer is a particularly good lawyer, and not every Jewish man is a particularly good businessman. Many of them go bust. That's just the nature of business. And that belief that we are all somehow shrewd and cunning and all of that, it perpetuates a latent idea that we focus on money and that we scheme to acquire more. When people talk about Jewish racial features, big nose, swarthy or dark skin, small stature, all Jews are short, that kind of stuff, they're not doing anthropology, but they are perpetuating stereotypes that were chosen precisely because they are the opposite of Western European ideals. Right? When the Aryans were describing what a Jew was, they looked at the statue of their Nordic, Thor, and they said, Jews must be the opposite of that. Remember, Germany versus Jews, that's Hitler's idea. So if the German goal is to be Thor, the Jews must be physically the opposite. So if Thor is tall, Jews are short. If Thor is pale, Jews are dark. If Thor is blonde hair, we must have dark hair. If Thor has a smallish nose, we must have big nose. I mean, it is a built-in opposite just to make that idea, right? And even before we had the increasing modern diversity of Judaism, we have had a broad range of physical features. If you go back into the Middle Ages and you travel from Yemen to Egypt, to Morocco, to Spain, to England, to France, to Poland, you will find Jews that looked different in all of those countries. We have never been a one size fits all kind of people. Because again, we're not a race. We have always added people into wherever we went from every race, and we have mixed, and we are now a wonderful genetic mix. And when people talk about our loyalty to America because we are somehow less native or attached to this nation because of our Jewishness, They are using a standard that is never applied equally. Very recently, we had, unfortunately, a comment made by our own president during Hanukkah celebrations, where he said to the American Jewish leaders that we came from a great country. And he didn't mean this one. He was saying our holiday came from part of our great country, meaning Israel. I don't think he meant it explicitly, but as Jews, we are very sensitive to any hint that someone may be saying that this is not our home, that we are somehow foreigners here in a way that is different from other people that live here. I mean, we are all mostly foreigners here to one degree or another. And, Christmas came across on the Mayflower, just as Hanukkah came with, the first Jews from Brazil. So we are all imports as far as our faith and our practices go. And again, I don't believe that our president intended that to be an anti-Semitic remark. I don't think that at all. But I do think it was still hinting at an underlying belief that somehow Jews are not quite 100% here. And so this is something we have to continue to work against, to help people understand that Jews are American, and Jews are also wonderfly diverse, and Jews also have a culture that still works very well with everyone. And for the theological problems, I would just hope that people who have those theological disagreements with us would understand that we are always open to discussion and debate. In fact, I'm doing an interfaith panel tomorrow morning for one of our local colleges. And we are equally able in this country to practice our religion freely. And that should be what we are allowed to do. With that, we'll have to call it good night because I have a Shiva to attend.
No, it's okay.
I'll meet you outside.
Okay.
Yes,
All right, no worries.
Interesting.
Good education. So I've been telling